Hey everyone, and welcome to another Unity RPG tutorial. So in this tutorial we're going to be setting up a simple spell system. So this is just going to be the basics for actually creating the different spells and then making it so we can press a button and call each one of those spells. So in the future we're going to make it so we can actually put all those spells onto an NPC where we can buy or train the spells. And then from there, once it's put into our book of spells, we can grab the spell and drag it onto our cast bar. So right now it's just going to be pretty much the first part of creating that system. In the future we will add the other systems as well and make it a little bit more advanced and add different key bindings and stuff for each different spell, and also allowing it so we can set the different targets. So maybe for a healing spell you can only target friendly players or yourself, or if it's a spell like an attack spell, something like a fireball or something like that, only enemy targets can be targeted with those spells, so you can't cast it on maybe friendly players or yourself. And yeah, so the first thing you're going to want to do is create a C# script, and we're just going to name this spell, and this is going to be something that we can turn into an array and actually add in a bunch of different spells. We're just going to make this pretty basic right now with a couple of just simple features, but in the future we'll add a bunch more advanced stats, maybe for different ranks and stuff. But yeah, for now that's all we're going to need to set up, and we'll go jump into our code. So in our actual spell, we just want to set it up with a couple of different variables. This is what we're going to be putting into an array of spells that we can actually use. So right now I just have a couple of different variables. You could add a lot more into this if you want. Maybe something like the amount of spell damage or anything like that, the different ranks. But for now we can just keep track of that all in the ID, and we can name it whatever we want. Right now that won't be too much of a big deal. We're pretty much just going to be referencing the ID for now. And once we actually create more of the UI for the spells, so when we hover over, an icon for that spell, we might want to see the different stuff like the rank or the name of the spell or the description of the spell. But for testing, we're just going to be setting up a simple button we can press to activate the different spells. And yeah, so we're just going to be applying these variables here, and then that's what we're going to be using when we're actually putting it into the array so we can make a bunch of different stuff. So this is pretty much all we need, and we're just going to jump into our user stat script and program the rest. So from here we're going to need two different variables. One will be for all spells. Now if you're actually creating a more advanced spell system, I would suggest creating another script entirely just dedicated to the different spells and stuff. Maybe if you're using a certain class, they would have certain types of spells, like if you wanted to create a rogue class, you could say rogue spells or mage spells or something like that, just to keep track of the different class setup. So in that case, when you're actually casting the spells, we're not searching through and checking any of the other spells. It'll just be a lot of extra code there that we don't really need to add in. So in this case, we're just going to be setting up just a testing thing. So we're just going to be using all spells. So pretty much we're going to be taking the stats from the spell script, and when we add it in, each one in the array will have its different set of spells that we can set. And from there we can actually go in, and for the player spells, so this is going to be the current spells that our player has currently learned, or spells maybe they automatically get when they enter into the game. So if you just wanted to start them off with one or two spells and then they have to learn more spells in the future, we can add to there. So at the start of our function for testing, we're going to be adding just two spells. So we're going to be adding it to the player spell slot from the all spells. So let's say in our all spells we had 10 different spells, and the first two spells are the ones we want to give to our player right away. So we're going to be grabbing the spells from the 0 slot and the 1 slot of the array of all spells, and we want to put it into our player spells, so the first and second slot of our player spells. So in this case, it's just transferring all the current variables that we want from our all spells, and we're plugging in each one of our array to there. And we're just doing it for both. So this is pretty much transferring all of the variables that we have here just from one array to another array. Now, if you wanted to just transfer the ID, then all these other ones for the icon, name, and description would all be blank. So if you're trying to reference these, you might run into errors if you don't transfer everything. But for now, yeah, we're mostly just focusing on the ID, since we're not going to be doing anything with the GUI in this tutorial. In future ones, we will add the stats when we hover over the actual buttons themselves. So here is where we're setting up just the test for these spells. So when I press the number 5 key or number 6, we're going to be doing use spell, which I'll jump down here real quick and show you. So for use spell, we want to transfer in, when we call this, the ID of whatever we're casting, so for the spell. And I should also state that we're not really keeping track currently of the amount of mana that we use or if we can actually cast or not. We're just basically testing out the spell system to see if it works. So we're going to be passing the ID of the actual button we pressed. So if we go back up here, use spell, and then for this we're going to be using userspell0.id. So whatever we set that ID as, the ID is going to be referenced to what spell we are using. So in the array, if 0 is a fire spell, it will use a fire spell. If 1 is a frost spell, we'll use a frost spell. So that's pretty much what we're grabbing to what we have in our current spells. And normally we would use some kind of keybind system. We'll probably add that in the future, just so we can change up the different buttons on our an action bar. So maybe if you drag a fire spell to the first slot and we press the 1 key, we wanted to activate a fire spell. So we can just set an array of key bindings, and that's what we would use to use the spell and what we'd check for. But for right now, we're not going to have anything that we're referencing to besides the actual just ID of whatever that spell is set to. So it's a very basic way of setting that up. And from here, it's going to take the ID, so whichever spell we used, it'll plug it into this switch statement, and it'll go and set up whichever case statement, or whatever this number is, it's going to check and see which one of these numbers is that. So we should probably actually just set this to 0 for now. We'll just leave the first one 0 instead of 1. And if you end up casting a spell and there's nothing there, then we probably have an error. So if none of these are called, this one's the default for what's being called. So when we cast this, the 5 key should display this first one, and then the 6 key should display the next one, depending on the ID. So we'll save this, and we have to go set up the arrays and the spells in our game or on our player where the arrays are located. So we'll jump back into game and set that up. So from here, we just have to go onto our player, since that is where we're keeping the current script for the array. Let's let that load. So if we go down here, we'll actually see 2 new slots for all spells and player spells. So all spells we could set, like I said, something like 10. So if you want to reference like a different spell, you would just add a new number into the array. So if we scroll up here real quick, you would end up changing the all spells. Let's say you wanted to be spell number 9 instead to be plugged into the first player slot. So you just go in and find the 9 slot, since it starts at 1 from 0. So that's the spell that it would grab. So in this case, we're just using the first and second slot. So from here, we're not going to really worry about any of this. We're just worried about the ID. And if we want to, we can actually check the name. We can actually print the name of what we want in the future. But for now, we're just going to be referencing these different IDs for which spell is called. Since when we use the spell, it'll tell us which spell number was actually activated. So now we can go into player spells, and we can leave that at 0. because when we actually start the game, or let's see here. So I guess what we can do for this case, you could set it up through code, but depending on how many spells your player can have, I mean, we could set this to the maximum number of spells and only allow the player to reference a certain number of those spells if we really wanted to. But for now, we'll just put 2 in there because the only amount of spells that we're including is 2 from here. So if we were adding any more spells from all spells into here, we would need this size to be bigger. But for now, we'll just leave it at 2. And we can save this. And so when we start the game, this should be 0 and this should be 1, since this is the default. So I guess in any case, it might be better to put 1, just so it's not referencing a spell at all if we transferred it in for the ID, unless we just have a basic spell built in. But for testing, we'll just leave it like that. So if we jump into game, you see that set as 1. Actually, we can jump out real quick, and I guess we could name these real quick just so I can show you in there. So we'll do test 1 and test 2. And we'll close that. Now these should be test 1 and test 2, just to demonstrate what it's actually doing. It's transferring the code from our all spells into here. So if you had these, labeled as different spells, they will show up differently in your inventory. And we're going to be using this actual adding system when we're adding the spells to our spell book and whatnot, and transferring it to our keybinds and everything. So I was just wanting to demonstrate that. So when we actually press 5 or 6, so I press the 5 key, use my first spell, and if I press 6, you can see that it used that one. So if I keep pressing 5, it'll cast the first spell. If I press 6, it'll cast the second spell, and so forth. So you can see that it's referencing completely different spells. So what we're going to do in the future actually for these different spells is in here we can actually put the actual spell code. So if it's something, let's say like an AoE attack, we can instantiate a spear cast and deal damage that way. If it was a fireball, then we'll just put the code in here that would calculate how to set up or cast an actual fireball and whatnot and so forth. So that's a basic way to set up a spell system using like that stuff. So in the future we will add a lot more advanced mechanics to this, but for now I just wanted to do a first part of this just for setting it up, since this tutorial is probably going to be pretty long, just trying to cover everything. But I will see you guys in the next tutorial.